for coming on such a short notice. I know that some of you were just contacted very late yesterday about this morning. Thanks very much for doing this. I'm going to introduce the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration, Minister Chris Alexander, has taken time out of his very busy schedule to join us this afternoon to answer a few questions you might have regarding the new bill or anything regarding or pertaining to the citizenship immigration that he covers in his portfolio. As always, a supporter of our community, MP Costas Menegakis, the hardworking Member of Parliament for Richmond Hill, has also taken time out of his schedule to be here this afternoon. So I thank them both for his time. Thank Mr. Tabrizi for hosting this event as always. What we're going to do is we have about a 15-minute time with you guys. So if you have any questions, if you don't mind, just ask, and the Minister or Member of Parliament Costas Menegakis will answer. I'll open it to the Minister and MP Menegakis to introduce themselves, and then we'll go to the questions.
Great. Do you want to say something?
You want to go ahead?
You say something on that.
Well, welcome everybody. It's certainly a pleasure to be here with all of you today. Thank you for taking your time out. Thank you, Michael, for arranging this, Mr. Tabrizi, on short notice, bringing us together, and a big thank you to the Minister for joining us here. Please feel free to ask any questions you have. The Minister is here with us for a little while this afternoon, and certainly I'm available at any time, as always, to meet and speak with you on these important issues. As we all know, the Canadian community of Persian descent is very dynamic, particularly in this part of the country, and a very strong contributor not only to Richmond Hill, but indeed to Ontario and across Canada. So it's important to us that we communicate with you these important measures that we put in place that strengthen Canadian citizenship, strengthen all of our lives in all communities across the country. And to that end, we have Canada's Citizenship and Immigration Minister here with us, Minister Alexander, who is the head of Citizenship and Immigration, and will be available to answer any and all of your questions that you might have. Thank you again for joining us, Minister.
Thank you, Costa. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you very much for being here today. Salam alaikum, Khush Amadeen, and Ramazan Mubarak to those celebrating the great holy month, which this year coincides with Canada Day. So we are reflecting in these days on all that it means to be Canadian, to be Canadian citizens, and what we've done to strengthen that citizenship, strengthen this country in recent years. And I'm grateful to Michael for bringing us together, to Mr. Tabrizi for inviting us into this great institution, and to all of you for being here. The important thing for me is to answer your questions. So I will be very brief, just to set the context for the discussion we've been having today at a few locations in the GTA about citizenship, because this really is one of the great achievements that our Conservative government has had over the last 9 years. We can talk about the strong economy and how we are more stable, more attractive as a destination for investment, a lower tax jurisdiction than ever before, lowest taxes since Diefenbaker. That's a long time. All of that has strengthened Canada. We can also talk about our international achievements, what we're doing for maternal, newborn, and children's health in the world, leadership of our Prime Minister, our leadership in facing down today's threats, whether it's Vladimir Putin in Ukraine or the threat of jihadist terrorism in Syria, Iraq, and unfortunately elsewhere. Canada does these things because the country's based on certain principles, strong foundations, the rule of law, freedom, democracy, and all of that is summed up by our citizenship. Our citizenship is the reflection of all of those achievements that we have as individuals, that we have as communities, that we have as a country. And that's why it's important. And so when I look back on only 2 years in this portfolio, one of the absolute highlights is the fact that we have put citizenship on firm foundations, firmer foundations than ever before. The last renewal of our Citizenship Act was back in 1977, a different era, before the internet, before many of the threats and opportunities that we now see in 2015. We had a cumbersome decision-making process, a 3-stage process. It's now 1 stage. As a result of those changes, and Costas Menegakis, my parliamentary secretary, was absolutely crucial to bringing this bill, shepherding this bill through Parliament, we are now, for the first time, reducing, and we will eventually eliminate the backlog of applications of new Canadians to become citizens. Last year, 261,000 Canadians became citizens. That's the largest number ever in Canadian history. And that fast pace continues this year. We're also enhancing the value of citizenship by saying the residency requirement is now 4 years out of 6. The language and knowledge requirements apply to everyone from high school age to retirement. And we know that these requirements are important because they actually help citizens achieve more in their lives when these requirements are met. They help them to participate more fully faster in Canadian life. And we see those results in the fact that 84% of immigrants to Canada go on to become citizens. No other country comes close to having that rate of conversion, if you will, of immigrants into citizens. But we also have to protect our citizenship. And we've done that for more than a decade now through revocation of citizenship when we know that it was fraudulently obtained, when we know that someone falsely represented themselves. Say the application claimed the person had no criminal record. We find out years later there is a murder conviction in Germany or elsewhere. That can lead to revocation, just as finding out that someone was committed atrocities during the Rwandan genocide or some other dark chapter in recent history. Those are grounds for revocation of citizenship, and they are uncontroversial. No one wants fellow citizens achieving this great privilege that we all value through fraud or through false representation, fraudulent documents, making claims that are untrue. And those provisions have been in place for 12 years. They've been uncontroversial. They were introduced by a Liberal government. They were uncontroversial until now and remain uncontroversial. In the new bill, which came in and under provisions that came into effect in June, we have a few additional grounds for revoking citizenship. One of them is in cases where a Canadian has been convicted of terrorism by a Canadian court or an equivalent court, and they are a dual national. So how many people does this apply to? We have very small numbers of terrorist convictions in Canada, but we have a very large number of Canadians who absolutely think this is the right thing to do. The decision is not made by a minister or an official in the Department of Citizenship and Immigration. A conviction for terrorism comes from a court. And if the convicted person doesn't like the outcome, they can appeal to a court of appeal, ultimately to the Supreme Court. Once again, it's a small number of people, dozens, not hundreds, fortunately, in Canada, and it only applies to dual nationals because, while I think most Canadians would like to see us revoke the citizenship of all convicted terrorists, we have a responsibility as a member of the international community under the 1961 Convention on Statelessness not to make people stateless without any nationality at all. And so anyone who has one citizenship only will not be subject to these provisions. And the revocation will only happen when there's a court decision and proof that the individual is a dual national. Those provisions came into effect in June, late June. We're starting to act on them now. Again, as far as terrorism is concerned, the numbers are very small. This form of revocation can also apply in cases of treason or espionage, very serious crimes, again, which are not often committed in Canada. And once again, only on the basis of a court-sanctioned conviction under the Criminal Code of Canada. And my question to anyone who talks about different classes of Canadian citizenship is, why are you sowing fear? Why are you misrepresenting the law? Under our law, there is only one citizenship. It is stronger than ever. It is more popular than ever. It is more accessible than ever. And it can also be revoked under extreme circumstances. No one ever challenged revocation for fraud or false representation. Terrorism is a much more serious crime. And I think most Canadians join us, the vast majority of Canadians join us in thinking that convicted terrorists, when they're dual nationals, should forfeit their Canadian citizenship, and that is the new rule. That is the only new rule. And anyone who is suggesting that larger numbers of Canadians will lose their citizenship is, quite frankly, fear-mongering, is, quite frankly, distorting reality. And at a time when Canadians are prouder than ever to be who we are and to be doing what we do at home and abroad, I think it's important that we get the facts straight. So thanks for being here, and looking forward to your questions. Please.
All right, thank you so much for your time and your explanation. So my first question is, as you may know, after closing the embassy in Iran, Iranians go through so many difficulties in Iran because they have to go to Turkey first to do the fingerprint and one more time to receive the visa. And Iranian government thinks that this was an undiplomatic act because Canada closed down the embassy first. So my question is, are you planning in the future to reopen the consulate in Iran, or what do you think of this undiplomatic act?
Sure. Well, I think it was much more than an undiplomatic act to flaunt IAEA safeguards, to mislead the whole world about a nuclear program which was actually being pursued while the Iranian regime claimed it was not. I mean, these are the kinds of issues that forced Canada to take the difficult decision we took about closing an embassy. It is not only undiplomatic, it is criminal, and it is a threat to international peace and security for a state to sponsor terrorism. And unfortunately, the Iranian regime remains one of the only states ever listed by Canada for that. And so you have to see the closure of our embassy, the threats to our staff in their proper context, which is the context that we know today. And we certainly hope a verifiable, credible agreement can be reached with regard to the nuclear program. Those negotiations are continuing. In the meantime, Canada is giving service to Iranians. The numbers of Iranian citizens who received visas to visit Canada, study permits to come to Canada, 10-year multiple entry visas to come to Canada last year, set a new record. And you're right, they didn't receive the service in Tehran, but many are making applications online. Many are using Ankara. Many are using other Canadian embassies and visa offices in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Europe, and in other parts of the world. And we welcome that, and we are doing everything in our power to improve service, to put it online, to ensure that those legitimate travelers from Iran who want to come to Canada, who have family here, are able to travel here. But the rhetoric of the Iranian government is well known, and we will take our decisions on the basis of the foreign policy that we have, and Iran has done more than enough to justify the concerns that we continue to have.
Sorry, Minister, your statement is contradicted with your Mr. Jason Kenney when he said that he's closing the embassy because of the questioning Canadian embassy staff for the Basij. So it is the new staff.
No. That's exactly what I mentioned. We took the decision out of a concern for our staff. But what kinds of countries violate the Vienna Convention and cannot fail to protect the diplomatic representatives of other countries? These are regimes like the Iranian regime, which continues to be listed by Canada as a state sponsor of terrorism and continues to fail to give their negotiating partners all the assurances they need to do a deal on nuclear energy. Those are the reasons that led to threats against our staff. The explanation is absolutely the same, and that's what I said.
Hopefully this week everything will be solved and Canada will open to the new relation.
If I just might add very quickly, at the time of the closure, the Prime Minister was very clear that our quarrel is not with the Iranian people. Our quarrel was specifically, and is, with the Iranian regime. And the reasons for the closure that were cited by the then Minister of Foreign Affairs, John Baird, were clear. It had to do, as the Minister said, with the closure, with the possible nuclear component of Iran's, a possible military component of Iran's nuclear program. It had to do with Iran's, the then President Ahmadinejad, with his rhetoric and comments against the State of Israel, calling for the annihilation of a neighboring country. It had to do with Iran's clear violation of human rights by the regime against its own people. You all know that there are Iranian people living in our community that fear for their lives if they go back to the country. Examples like Saeed Malikpour, for example, and so many others that are very well established Canadians of Iranian descent here that can't even visit the land they were born in. It had to do with Iran's violation of the Vienna Convention, which they proved not only against the American embassy in the 70s, but certainly against the British embassy in 2010, and intelligence that we had that there could possibly have been some movement against our diplomats, our staff. People that work in embassies are civilians, they're not soldiers. They deserve to be safe, amongst other things. So there were a number of things that were stated at the time, but the Prime Minister was abundantly clear on many, many occasions that our quarrel is not with the Iranian people. It had to be due specifically with the regime, and we all know that the Canadian community of Persian descent, not only in this region but across the country, is very dynamic, is very vibrant, is very progressive, is contributing in a big way to not only their families but to the Canadian economy right across this entire country. We're very fortunate to have such a dynamic community in a very short period of time. It's one of the newer communities that really got established from the 80s onwards, play such a significant role in continuing to build our great nation here. It has, the closure of the embassy has an unintended consequence of making it somewhat more difficult for folks to have their interactions with their loved ones back and forth. But as the Minister said, record numbers of people from Iran are coming. And I'll close with this. As the Member of Parliament for Richmond Hill, I sign certificates every month welcoming Canadian citizens to the country, over 300 every month, the vast majority of which are people that come from Iran, that come through my office, that we assist them and we help them. And that has not subsided at all. In fact, that's increased over time, thanks in part to this legislation, Bill C-24.